I was 3,000 miles from home when the fever hit, and I didn't have a single person in that city who would notice if I disappeared. I'd flown out to Denver for a work conference, the kind of trip where you tell yourself you'll explore the city, and instead spend 4 nights in a hotel room reviewing slides. By the third night, my throat felt like it was lined with gravel, and I told myself it was just the dry mountain air. By the fourth night, I couldn't keep water down, and my skin had gone the color of old paper. I called the front desk and asked if there was a doctor on call, and the woman on the other end of the line told me, very kindly, that I should probably just go to urgent care if it got worse. It got worse at 1 in the morning. I want to be clear about something, because I know how this sounds when you say it out loud after the fact. I wasn't an idiot. I knew what 9/11 was for. But I was alone in a hotel room in a city where I knew no one. My insurance card was a company-issued thing I'd never actually used, and the only person who'd ever walked me through what to do in a medical emergency, the only person whose voice I wanted in that moment, was my mother. I called her because I was scared, and because some primal, stupid, hopeful part of me still believed that if I called my mother and told her I was dying, she would tell me what to do, and somehow that would make it less true. She didn't answer. I called again. Straight to voicemail the second time, which meant she'd silenced it, which meant she'd seen my name on the screen and made a choice. I called my stepfather next, because even though I'd never been close to him, he was logical. He was the kind of man who kept a first aid kit in his trunk and knew what a deductible was. He didn't pick up either. I called my mother 4 more times in a row, the kind of frantic redialing where you're not even thinking anymore, you're just pressing the same green button over and over, like it's a slot machine that has to pay out eventually. By call number 9, I was on the bathroom floor of a Hampton Inn, my cheek against the cold tile, sweat soaking through the hotel robe I hadn't bothered to take off. I left a voicemail I don't fully remember leaving. I'm told later, by someone else, what I said. I said I thought something was really wrong with me. I said I didn't know what to do. I said please. What I know now, what I didn't know then, was that my mother had her phone on silent because she was at a candlelight vigil/celebration my younger half-sister was hosting for her engagement. Not even the actual party. A soft launch gathering 2 days before the real one, mostly so my sister could post about it. My mother had turned her ringer off out of respect for the ambiance. I don't remember calling 911. I'm told I did, eventually, somewhere around call 17 to my parents, my hands shaking too badly to manage the numbers cleanly, my vision tunneling. What I remember is a stranger's voice through the door. Her name was Renee. She was a housekeeper doing the overnight restock on my floor, an older woman, maybe upper 50s, originally from Trinidad, with a voice that had a sing-song lilt to it even when she was frightened, which she clearly was when she heard something heavy hit the bathroom floor through the thin connecting wall. She knocked. I couldn't answer. She used her master key. She found me half-conscious, burning up, and she didn't hesitate. She called the front desk. She called 911 herself, and she stayed with me, holding a wet washcloth to the back of my neck, talking to me in this low, steady voice the whole time, telling me I was going to be fine, telling me her own daughter had nearly died from something similar years back, telling me to stay with her, to keep my eyes open, to keep talking. It was sepsis. A kidney infection that had gone untreated for too long and turned into something that was actively trying to shut my organs down one by one. By the time the paramedics got me to the ER, my blood pressure had dropped to a number the doctor later described, very calmly, as not compatible with consciousness much longer. I was in the ICU within the hour. I was on a ventilator within 3. I don't remember most of the next 2 days. I remember fragments. A nurse's hand. The particular blue of the privacy curtain. The sound of a machine that beeped in a rhythm I would later learn matched my own erratic heartbeat. At one point, my heart rate dropped low enough that a code was called. The kind where a small army of people in scrubs surrounds your bed and starts moving with a speed and silence that tells you, even half-conscious, that this is the real thing. I don't remember dying, if that's even the right word for it, but I remember a gap, a stretch of nothing, and then the unbearable, blinding fact of being alive again, gasping around a tube, someone's hand gripping mine so hard it hurt. It wasn't my mother's hand. When I finally surfaced enough to understand where I was, a nurse named Dana told me, gently, that my emergency contacts had been notified. She said it the way you'd report a fact you weren't thrilled to be reporting. I asked if my mom had come. Dana's face did something complicated. Something that wasn't quite pity but was standing right next to it. Someone's been very involved in your care, she said carefully. I'll let the doctor explain. That should have told me everything. but I was too sick and too drugged to read between the lines yet. The doctor, a sharp, no-nonsense woman named Dr. Whitcomb, came in not long after. She had the kind of face that had clearly delivered a lot of hard news in her career and had developed a way of doing it that was kind without being soft, which I would come to appreciate more in the days that followed. She told me how close it had been. She used the word critical twice and the word lucky once, and not in reference to my family. Then she paused, glanced toward the door the way people do when they're deciding how much to say, and told me something had happened the day before that I needed to know about. "Your mother came in," she said, "yesterday afternoon while you were still intubated." I remember feeling a flood of relief at that, stupidly, instinctively, the kind of relief a kid feels when they hear a parent's name, regardless of everything that parent has or hasn't done. She asked about discharge timing, Dr. Whitcomb continued, and I watched her choose her next words like she was picking through glass. She wanted to know how soon you could be moved, or released, given that you had obligations back home. I explained that you were not stable enough to be moved, let alone discharged, and that any attempt to interrupt your care at that stage could have been fatal. She became insistent. She asked to speak to a hospital administrator about expediting things. I lay there absorbing that the way you absorb information that doesn't fit anywhere in your understanding of the world yet. My mother. While I had a tube down my throat and a machine breathing for me. Asking about discharge timing. "I don't understand," I managed. My throat felt like it had been sanded down. "Expediting what?" Dr. Whitcomb's expression flickered, and that's when she told me about the wedding shower, not my sister's engagement party. The shower after that, the one happening that weekend, the one my mother had apparently flown out to Denver specifically to attend in person before realizing her other daughter was in an ICU 3 miles from the venue. According to what the hospital staff relayed, my mother's position was that she needed to know whether I'd be well enough to attend, or at least released so she could split her time. Because, in her words to one of the nurses, "Everyone's already flown in for this. We can't just cancel." I want to tell you my reaction was righteous fury. It wasn't. Not yet. It was a kind of bewildered numbness, the brain's polite refusal to process something too large to hold all at once. "There's something else, Doctor," Whitcomb said, and her voice changed slightly, softened in a different direction. "Before she left, your mother had what I'd call a disagreement with one of our case managers about your insurance situation. There was a gap in your coverage, something about a lapsed policy through your employer that hadn't synced with the new one yet. It would have triggered a hold on certain aspects of your continued treatment pending verification. Your mother declined to provide any financial guarantee to Bridget. She said, and I'm quoting the case manager's notes here, that it wasn't really their responsibility since you were a grown woman with your own insurance. I felt that one land somewhere deep, somewhere below the physical pain. So what happened? I asked. With the hold? That's when Dr. Whitcomb told me about the man in the gray cardigan. She said a man had been in the ICU waiting area that whole stretch, there for an entirely different patient, his own father, who'd had a stroke 2 floors up. He'd noticed the commotion at the nurse's station, my mother's raised voice, the case manager's increasingly tense replies. He hadn't meant to listen. You don't mean to listen in places like that. But hospital waiting rooms have a way of stripping privacy down to nothing, and he'd heard enough to understand that a woman barely conscious down the hall might lose access to continued treatment because nobody present was willing to vouch for her. He'd asked quietly what it would take to resolve the hold. When he learned the number, he didn't blink. He walked to billing and paid it himself, no conditions, no fanfare, then went back to the waiting room and sat with his father's situation like nothing unusual had happened. He's still here, actually, Dr. Whitcomb said. I believe he's down in the family lounge. He's asked twice how you're doing. I didn't know what to do with that information. A stranger had paid to keep me alive, casually, the way you'd cover a coworker's lunch tab, while my own mother had stood in that same hallway calculating logistics around a party. I met him properly 2 days later once they'd weaned me off the ventilator, and I could speak in something resembling full sentences. His name was Walter Hines. He was somewhere in his early 60s, broad through the shoulders in the way of a man who'd worked with his hands for most of his life before retiring into something quieter, and he had this unhurried, watchful kindness to him, the kind that doesn't announce itself. He wore the same gray cardigan 3 days running, which I later learned was because he hadn't planned to be in Denver more than a weekend and had packed accordingly for his father's situation, not for an extended stay made longer by both of us. He sat in the chair beside my bed, the one that still had my mother's coffee cup ring on the side table from her one visit, and he apologized of all things for intruding. You didn't intrude, I told him, my voice still cracked and unfamiliar to my own ears. You saved my life. Twice, basically. Once by paying, and I guess once by just being a person who pays attention. He waved that off the way people do when they don't think what they did was remarkable, which somehow made it more remarkable. He told me about his father, about the stroke, about how he'd flown in, not knowing if his dad would still recognize him when he landed. He told me, almost as an aside, not fishing for sympathy, that he'd lost his wife to cancer 4 years earlier, and that something about hospitals now made him hyper-aware of who had someone in the room with them and who didn't. You didn't have anyone in the room, he said simply. That's really all it was. I asked him, eventually, why he stayed. Why a man with his own father upstairs, fighting his own fear, would spend 3 afternoons checking in on a stranger down the hall. He thought about that for a second before answering. Because somebody should, he said. And I had the time, and I had the means, and not everybody does. Seemed wrong to walk past that. I started crying. The ugly kind, the kind you can't perform even if you wanted to, because nobody had ever explained their kindness to me in such plain, unsentimental terms before. My own family explained their cruelty in elaborate terms. Timing, obligation, context, the unfortunate collision of my crisis with my sister's calendar. This man explained kindness like it was the most obvious math in the world. My mother and stepfather came back the next afternoon, after the shower, on their way to the airport. My mother walked in already mid-sentence, explaining that she'd had her phone on silent because you know how loud those venues get. As though the venue were the relevant detail and not the 17 missed calls from her dying daughter. She glanced at the IV line in my arm, at the hospital gown, at me, with an expression that read more like inconvenience than fear. You look better than I expected, she said, which I have turned over in my mind more times than I'd like to admit, trying to find a kind interpretation. I haven't found one yet. She asked about the flowers on the windowsill. Walter had brought a small, unpretentious bunch of grocery store daisies the day before, the kind of gesture that costs $12 and means more than anything my mother has ever given me. I told her a man named Walter had brought them, that he'd also paid an outstanding bill that would otherwise have interrupted my treatment. She blinked, processed it for exactly as long as it took to find it strange, and then moved on to asking whether the hospital had decent coffee, because the flight had been brutal. My stepfather stood near the window with his arms crossed the entire visit, the way he always has, present in the way furniture is present. He said at one point that it was good I pulled through, in the tone you'd use about a stock that had a rough quarter and recovered. They stayed 35 minutes. They left because they had a connecting flight, and because, as my mother reminded me on her way out, your sister's actual wedding is in 8 months, and there's a lot still to plan. She kissed my forehead like it was a box to check and told me to rest up. I lay there after they left and did something I hadn't expected to do, which was nothing. No tears, no anger, just a strange, settling clarity, the kind that arrives only after you've stopped hoping for a particular outcome. I had spent 28 years rearranging myself to be small enough, easy enough, low maintenance enough to earn a kind of attention that, it turned out, was never coming, not because I hadn't tried hard enough, but because the attention had never been allocated to me in the first place. You can't outperform an allocation, you can only stop applying for it. Walter visited twice more before I was discharged. The second time, he brought his daughter, a sharp, funny woman named Carmen, who worked as a paralegal, and who, upon hearing the full story, including the insurance hold, and my mother's comment about it not being their responsibility, got a very specific, focused look on her face and asked if she could take some notes. I let her. It turned out there were genuine grounds to push back on how the insurance gap had been handled by my employer's plan, separate from anything my mother had or hadn't done. And Carmen, essentially for free and out of what I can only describe as professional offense on my behalf, helped me file the right paperwork to get most of it sorted before I even left the hospital. I found out weeks later that Walter had also quietly mentioned the situation to the hospital's patient advocacy office, not to make trouble, but because he believed there should be a record of how close that insurance hold had come to costing someone their life over a parent's unwillingness to vouch for them. He never told me he'd done it. I learned from a follow-up letter the hospital sent, thanking me for bringing administrative gaps to their attention, which confused me until I put the pieces together. I'm fully recovered now, as much as anyone is fully recovered from nearly dying alone on a bathroom floor in a city you don't live in. Physically, yes, the rest of it moves slower. My relationship with my mother since then has been what a therapist I started seeing afterward calls structurally honest, which is a polite way of saying I stopped pretending. I see her twice a year, briefly, at events I can't reasonably avoid. I don't call her when something is wrong anymore. I learned, in the most expensive way possible, exactly how far down her list I sit. And once you know your real position, it's hard to keep performing for a higher one. Renee, the housekeeper who found me, I still send a Christmas card to every year, with something extra inside it that she always tries to refuse and always eventually accepts. Walter and I talk most weeks. His father recovered enough from the stroke to walk with a cane and complain extensively about hospital food, which Walter reports to me with real delight. Like, good news doesn't need to be dramatic to count. Carmen and I have become something between friends and unofficial sisters. The kind of bond that didn't require 28 years of shared history to feel solid, just one terrible week and the right two people showing up for it. I think about Renee's hands on my neck with that washcloth, and Walter's quiet certainty that somebody should help. And I understand now that family was never actually about the people who share your blood. It's about the people who hear you on the other side of a wall, or in a waiting room, and decide, without needing to be asked twice, that your survival is worth their time. My mother had 17 chances to be that person for me, and a stranger in a gray cardigan needed exactly 0. If you've ever called the people who were supposed to love you and heard nothing but silence, I hope you find your Renee, your Walter, your people who show up uninvited and unasked, because somewhere out there, they're listening for you too.